been a great time, and I'm just delighted to be a part of this conversation. So thank you for staying with us, and I really look forward to the rich conversation we're going to have together. So I want to remind you of a couple things. One is to be thinking of your questions. The Slido.com is a really important way for us to have an interaction. So I know this conversation is going to stimulate questions because we are going to really bridge theology and economic wisdom. And so I know it's going to be really important. I was asked by Greg, my good friend, to frame just a moment, and then I'm going to invite the panel up because you want to hear from them. Each one of them have prepared some initial thoughts before we go to questions on different areas of economic wisdom and how it relates to their particular field. So I want to do that. But I want to set the context for just a moment, is to say, John Perkins, the great John Perkins, has said something that I think is so deeply profound. As we think of human flourishing, John Perkins says two things are essential: Jesus and a job. And 30 years ago, as a pastor just coming out of seminary, I would have not even begun to grasp the profundity of John Perkins's insight. Because after I graduated from seminary, and I'm not blaming those wonderful teachers, but I came to the realization that I had a deeply impoverished theology. And that impoverished theology profoundly impoverished my understanding of the pastoral vocation and the paradigm that drove it. And of course, the consequence for any impoverished theology or impoverished pastoral vocational paradigm is an impoverished congregation and an impoverished culture and mission. And so I've had over 30 years made some significant adjustments into understanding a more robust theology that is deeply biblical and exegetical, one that brings systematic logic and consistency, but also canonical coherence. And this has profoundly shaped my own life, my formation and mission as a pastor that serves a wonderful church in Kansas City. So I just want to say that my own experience 30 years ago had a massive Sunday to Monday gap. The idea of the economics I studied in college, micro and macro, and Leffler curves and things like that, had no sense in my understanding as a pastor when I began. And today that has radically changed. Because the Sunday to Monday gap I experienced and perpetuated, I had to come to the place of confession and realizing my pastoral malpractice. So from that, I began to think deeply about why my work matters, why your work matters, and spent quite a bit of time unpacking individual importance of work, the meanness of work, not meanness, the meanness of work. And that is an important journey. And most of the faith and work conversation that I've been involved in for many years has been much more about the meanness of my work. And I even, wrote a book on my work, right? On work matters. But I began to realize the more I studied scripture and more interacted, that it's not just a privatized understanding of this, that we were created and redeemed, and as we think of creation and redemption and consummation, with a community in mind. And so I began to think about the importance of moving from me to we, the we-ness of our work. And I really think that is a very profound way to begin to build a bridge between theology and economic life, to begin to narrow that Sunday to Monday gap. So much of my thinking and much of our thinking today is to begin to think moving from me-ness and the stewardship of me and my calling to the stewardship of we-ness in our calling. And that is really the bridge to economic life and economic wisdom. So I want to share one verse, and I'm going to invite the panel up, but I want to share one verse to give you an example of a text of scripture that is so robust, so profound, and so transformational. Because the gospel not only informs our economic wisdom, it transforms it in economic life. The gospel informs and transforms. Rabbi Paul, who becomes the Apostle Paul, profoundly shows the implications of the gospel in terms of economic life. And one text that is so powerful is Ephesians 4:28. You know how that epistle is arranged. But Paul will unpack in profound ways the economic implications of gospel life that informs and transforms economic life. So in 4:28, Paul says, let the thief no longer steal. Now, I just want to highlight that right away he addresses economic injustice, right? That economics matter, injustice matters. Let the thief no longer steal. But notice where he goes. Let what? The person do honest work. There, he follows that same economic and justice theme. Laboring, working with their hands so that what? They may have the opportunity to give to anyone in need. So here we have, in the Apostle Paul's language, some of the main categories of how theology and the gospel profoundly shape economic life. It addresses economic injustice, transforms it, informs a new way of thinking. It profoundly shapes diligence of work and value creation and labor and exchange. But it also profoundly shows the stewardship we have in neighborly love to one another and lives a sense that capacity matters in generosity to give to anyone in need for the common good. So I'm just saying, even that small text brings some of the main themes I hope in our panel we are going to explore together in a much more robust way. But I just want to say one verse, you unpack that verse and think of the gospel implications of what a gospel-centered person is all about. Okay, so I want to highlight that just as a reminder. So as we have this conversation, I want to encourage us to understand that we're going to need economic wisdom, that we're going to need the Spirit's empowerment. We're going to need a collective wisdom to navigate the world, to be a faithful presence in our world, and to be fruitful. And we live in a very complex, ever-changing global economy, and we live in a broken world where the actors in the economic theater must have virtue. And much is going to depend, not just on the system, but the virtuous actors in the system. So I hope we're going to interact about that. I hope you've thought about that. We also want to make sure we understand the need for respectful dialogue. When I first wrote Work Matters, I had very little controversy because it was so deeply biblical and personal. But I started to enter into the sort of broader economic space and writing the economics of neighborly love. I go, wow, this has a lot of minefields because economics, by their very nature, but wisdom is a communal endeavor that affects policy and one another life and neighborly love. So we may come at it different ways. Just want you to know as we interact, I just want to set the stage, not in a defensive way, but in an encouraging way. But we may come at this economic implications and stewardship in different ways. And I hope, again, we will learn from one another, be respectful. And I am really, really looking forward to this conversation. One, because I don't have to do a TED Talk. I'm just saying, if you've done it. And my wife said to me, you're going to Dallas. I'm going to just listen to other brilliant people. I'm not going to say anything stupid. So I promise I won't say anything stupid. I want the panel to come up. You're going to hear from their their prepared conversations, and we're going to have a dialogue together. I hope you will engage with questions. Okay, we ready? So I want to invite the panel up. I want to come on up, panel. I'm going to have them introduce themselves in their interdisciplinary backgrounds because I shouldn't say that, that's terrible, right guys? We have a pastor who helps lead the Made to Flourish Network in Fort Lauderdale, which I'm very excited about being there in a couple of weeks, who also has a PhD in economics. That's a good blend, okay? And we have theological educators, pastors, Kevin Dudley, Brent Waters. We have Brent here. There is Brent, okay. Larry Ward, PJ Hill, and Isaac Frere. So I'm going to have you guys introduce yourself. And I also want to say one thing, since I have the opportunity. PJ Hill has been a remarkable mentor to me. Because even though I had a micro and macroeconomics and much in my undergraduate business area, when I began to explore the importance as a pastor, as a theologian, and as the role of economics, PJ particularly has been someone who has guided me and has helped me. So I'm just grateful for that. So Isaac, let's start with you and tell us a bit about yourself, and then I'd like you to share some of your thoughts on economic wisdom, and then we'll go down the way, and you can introduce yourself before you give your talks. Okay, guys? Thank you for joining us.
Sure. So I'll introduce myself, then talk, or?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. How's everybody doing? So my name is Isaac Petit Frere, or Isaac Frere. I'm from Fort Lauderdale. This has all been a new experience for me. Leaving the academic world, I taught at the University of Miami for 9 years, got into pastoral ministry. We just celebrated 3 days ago our first year as a church plant. So that's been exciting for us.
Amen.
As we're kicking off this new year, it was refreshing having a conversation with a fellow pastor who shared the vision of Made to Flourish. And for me, it was just an entirely new thing. I had never heard of faith and work or faith, work, and economics. And so I thought I was dumping my economic knowledge and throwing it to the side. And going into doing the good work for the Lord. And so to see that and to be a part of this has all been refreshing. I'm participating in these gatherings throughout the past few months. So I just wanted to share that this has been life-giving to me as I've been entering into this space, and hopefully have something to contribute as well going into it. Just a few thoughts that I was sharing. This conversation, again, I'm speaking about it less from a seminarian perspective, more from a practitioner perspective. But I've been thinking somewhat about where technology is in this space. And so these are just a few thoughts that I have that I would like to share with you guys as we move forward. Ever since I was a child, the future had always fascinated me. I loved watching the Jetsons. I wanted to watch movies like Back to the Future. I'll even watch Judge Dredd. It was just exciting, right, to watch movies about the future, because I think it not only tantalized my imagination, but it also it brought me to an anticipation of what is to come. And I think that is the story of the gospel, right? In the 4th chapter, where we await the consummation in eager anticipation, and we await for this new thing, this restoration of all things, the new earth. And so as I think, of course, about the future, and I think anyone can attest to this, that when we think about the future, we're thinking about the implementation of new technologies, right? When we think about the future, we're thinking about the wheel, fire. We're thinking about microwaves, right? Microwave ovens, or the television. And if you're a millennial, thank you, Helen. I don't know where she is, but if you're a millennial, you're thinking Wi-Fi, right? And so one particular technology that I can speak of that has transformed all of life is the smartphone. Yeah. Right. We quite literally we walk around with our offices and entertainment centers, and so there is an argument to be made there that technology has made life better, whatever that means, or we can at least attest that technology has made us more productive. We're able to do more with technology, but I think that in this day and age, we need to be more mindful about the new shift in technology. The shift in technology that moves us from the amelioration of life or the augmentation of life to a technology adoption that is leading to the replacement of human participation or the minimization of the human experience in this modern economy. We have to confront these realities of artificial intelligence and automation technology that is likely leading to a shift that we have never seen before. It would almost seem as if tech looks to replace the human experience. And so with these socioeconomic confrontations, it will require, I believe, at least a robust theological perspective that properly equips gospel practitioners in the field. And on the theological front lines of this is what we know as the cultural mandate, or the creation mandate, which we find in Genesis chapter 1, which ascribes humanity with the task of filling the earth, subduing the earth, ruling over the earth. That is, that this ontologically creative God breathes into created man, right? This creative spirit, this ruach into the man. But notice that there's a prerequisite to this, that he says, be fruitful and to multiply. That is, it isn't enough for us to be creative or to have creative imagination, but that we're to do something with that creative power. We weren't meant to simply be creative, but mankind was meant to be productive. And so this imago Dei, right, where our work doesn't simply mirror the image of God, but that we're shaped into the image of God by our work. It's to say this in quiet simplicity: mankind, for its own sake, needs to work, right? Mankind, for its own sake, has to work. And so we know the story, right? We know the story that sin enters the world. It adulterates the environment with which man works. And so in essence, it makes that task difficult. While there are thorns and thistles, Adam must continue to work. Adam must continue to tend and to keep the garden. But I think we're confronting another reality. How do we confront now the economic forces that don't necessarily make work difficult, but the economic forces that impede even the opportunity or the ability to work, right? This new technology in this new economy has a double-edged sword, right? On one side, it fulfills the dominion mandate, or it fulfills the cultural mandate that it finds more effective ways for us to get more out of this land that God has given us. So there's this one positive end, but on the other side of it, it wars against mankind, right? It wars against the inherent dignity of mankind and the sanctity of work, and in essence, and in some ways, pacifying, right, this cultural mandate. So I think, and I don't come with many answers here, but I think we need to ask the question that for us is how must we, in light of the Imago Dei, this cultural mandate, respond to this seemingly inevitable transition in this new economy in which there is a diminished demand in the workplace, diminished demand for labor, diminished demand for human capital. And I think part of that answer is that we need to begin to communicate into this new system, this message. We need to begin to communicate a morality that emphasizes that technology doesn't exist to replace or to minimize costs, but that it exists to augment life, to add value to life, that it isn't a replacement of labor, but rather an augmenter of labor. So our theological praxis, or the good dude yesterday, Mr. Wolf, talked about the CPU, right? This particularization. But how then do we now influence a worldview that establishes a morality that shapes policy, and it determines the motivations that work facilitates interpersonal reactions or interpersonal interactions, that work facilitates community? How do we infuse this message and present a worldview that's against the idea that technology exists simply for cost minimization or for profit maximization? You may have heard that term before in your econ class. Rather than being a catalytic cost minimizer, how then can we reframe what the purpose of technology is? And so I think if we can establish systems that value the dignity of work, if we can establish systems that look at work beyond itself or the product that it creates, but one that increases the value in the person that does the work, that technology adds value to the human experience in facilitating human interaction, then I think we can begin to change the trajectory of technological advancement. We can change the trajectory, one that finds dignity in all of mankind. So my last thought on that, not to take too much time, but I'm just kind of just thinking out loud on this. But I think there's also the danger of overextending the Imago Dei, in the sense that if we reach too far, that it may discourage, right, technological advancement. It may discourage research and development and the other things that are also associated with the cultural mandate. So I think all I'm really doing is inviting us to have a more substantive conversation as to where technology is in this space, because we live in a world now where it's going to be hard to find work because from a technological perspective, computers can do things a lot faster than our brains can. And with automation, computers can stay awake a lot longer than we can. And so where does that fit now in this space, and how will that affect us as gospel practitioners moving forward? So it was more of a question than anything else, but those were my thoughts.
Thank you, Isaac. Thank you, Isaac. Kevin?
Well, good morning. I see where to start here. I've had a long trajectory in history in many different spaces, and currently I'm serving in a pastorate of a congregation, about a third of my congregation, is living below the poverty line, many of them homeless. Another third solidly middle class, and another third some super wealthy. So I've never been in a context like that before where there's such tremendous diversity. But I am an MTF pastor, and I also happen to teach a bit at the Lutheran Seminary there in my city. Teach courses in urban ministry and systematic theology as well. But all of that I bring to bear in the work where I am, because it really informs how I approach the task of the pastorate and how we are very present in the city where I serve. I've been toying with this idea of hospitality and what that means for the church and in our various cities and respective locales where we operate. And one of the things I'm convinced of is that we have a very deficient theology of exile these days. Said a different way, it's apparent to me that we have become too much at home in the world the way that it is, instead of reaching to what the world can be as we operate and as we serve. And so we live in this very strange tension between our individual responsibilities and our communal accountabilities, and how we are able to serve those who are in proximity to us, and what it means to be church, what it means to be community in all of that. And so I want to argue that hospitality for me is entering into sacred space where we create common space for us to be together, to operate together, to work together, to serve together, as contrasted with the ways which we tend to operate in our default modes, places where we work and live and play. And we remain divided and we remain separated. And so everybody else becomes the stranger. I think we're missing something in that. There's very limited exposure of that word philoxenos in Greek New Testament. Obviously, Hebrews 13 would be the most prominent, where the writer says, do not neglect to show love or hospitality to the stranger. Don't stop loving the other. And it occurred to me that maybe we've gotten this wrong, because the only way that another is the other is when I maintain a center space. And if I maintain a center space, that means Christ is no longer central, but rather who I am and where I am. And so it's so easy to relegate everyone else to that other space. And I wondered what it would look like if we as individuals, if we as communities of faith, if we as institutions operated in a way that we truly showed hospitality, in the sense that we all agreed that we're all strangers, we're all aliens. So getting back to a theology of exile, I think allows us to enter that sacred space where there truly is a way for us to show one another hospitality. I think when we look at that word philoxenos, we get the first part of the who is the stranger right. In other words, we know that God is sending us to love one another, to love the stranger, to, even before that, love our sisters and love our brothers. We understand the why that we do it. We all are seeking ways to work out our salvation and to create opportunities for human flourishing. We're working towards shalom. We're trying to figure that out as we go. But I think it's the other part of that who that we miss. This idea that everyone else is the stranger and not me. There seems to be a resistance to that, because it's so comfortable to default back to the places that we know, to the places that we are most comfortable. It's so easy to default back to those places where it doesn't cost us anything, it doesn't require anything of us, and it's very hard to show hospitality to anyone else if we are entrenched in the places where we are. So here's an organizing question that I've been toying with. Can we maintain human life as sacred according to the way that we are currently institutionalized and organized? Or does it require that we step out of our comfortable spaces so that we can truly enter a common sacred space where we're all strangers, where Christ is central? And that obviously the problem with that is that we're burdened in our societies and in our culture the way that it is with hierarchy, which I maintain is a consequence of the fall, but never what God intended. We're burdened by unidirectional interaction, said differently, a very transactional mentality of how we relate with one another. And we're also burdened with various dualistic perspectives. It's always us and them. It's either in or out. And that complicates our relating as well. And so we tend to treat brothers and sisters as strangers, and we treat our strangers as enemies. And it becomes impossible or nearly impossible for us to show hospitality in this dehumanizing and dehumanized world that we happen to be a part of. I believe the gospel calls us to something deeper, something that is quite a bit more expensive than what we've been willing to pay thus far. And a failure to engage this kind of hospitality in a sacred and common space always results in a perpetual fractured community. And we miss so much of the flourishing, I believe, that the Lord wants us to be about. So for me, true community happens when we enter into that sacred space, that common space. In many of my conversations with colleagues at the seminary and even in the marketplace, the word marginalization is so popular. And people are only marginalized, again, when we maintain a center. But if Christ is center, truth be told, we're all on the margins. And we're all called to enter that marginalized space. We all are strangers. What would it look like if we truly operated in that way and existed in that space together, where it's not that one side brings something and the other side doesn't, but it's that we all bring our giftedness, we all bring our intellect, we all bring our opportunities for productivity to bear in this common space to actually make things different. It requires, for me, a sense of solidarity, of standing with people, and a sense of sacrifice. And what does that mean for us to actually pay what it cost? Hospitality, then, is working together for the common good as we're located in common ground. And I think somewhere in my training, that's what the common table was all about as well. It's not my table, it's not your table, but it's our table that we come and we dwell together. We fill that gap when I come with all that I am and all that I have, and my sister, my brother, and even those who were once relegated to the place of a stranger, when we all come to that common space and make things different.
Thank you, Kevin. Wonderful. PJ?
I'm PJ Hill. There we go, maybe. When I'm on programs here or at any of the Faith and Work, Oikonomia Network sorts of things, I'm almost always alone. I'm the only economist. It's a delight. Isaac and I here, actually there's a third economist here, Paul Oslington. If we could have put the three of us up here, we could have voted the rest of you off the panel. It's an unusual sort of an experience. My topic is justice and justice in economic systems. I'm going to start in the same way that Tom did when he talked about the verse from Ephesians. I'm going to start talking about injustices, because justice is a pretty hard concept for me to get my mind around. But if I think about the injustices in society, I can identify them, or it's easier to find some common agreement on injustices, and then I can move to the whole area of what does justice in economic systems look like. I regard apartheid in South Africa, where people's domain of labor was limited, as an injustice. I regard slavery as an injustice. I think of invasion of your home by uninvited guests in the middle of the night as injustice. I regard the use of police power in unequal ways towards particular peoples as injustice. Why are these injustices? They're injustices because of universal human dignity, because of the Imago Dei, because of our equal moral standing before God, and then that means we should have equal moral standing before the law. Now, what does that mean? I think it means, justice means for me, a system of rights, a robust doctrine, theology, understanding of rights. What's traditionally kind of goes under the name natural law or natural rights. There's a very clear role for the state there, the coercive power of the state, to protect people's rights. That mostly enforces what I would call a negative liberty. It tells you the sorts of things you can't do, but it opens up all sorts of domains in the civil society and in the economic sphere for people to take actions. Now, I know when you introduce rights into the Christian conversation, you end up, first, makes a lot of people pretty uncomfortable. And the idea is if we talk about rights, we're ignoring duties, our responsibilities to one another, the understanding that we are made in social situations and we relate in social situations. It's a statement of hyper-individualism, radical autonomy. I don't think it has to be that. I think that I still think I start with rights as my starting point, but I don't think it means that we have to, that means we live in radical autonomy, that we don't have duties to one another, that we don't understand that it's these associations that are just a critical part of our lives. And in fact, I would argue that that's an important role to articulate that for the church, for the Christian, for the community as a whole. Because the rights doctrine leaves us with a lot of space. I said it's mostly about negative liberty, but then what are we going to do with that space? That's where we articulate the meaning. That's where we articulate the responsibilities to one another, the duties, the deep civil society, the responsibility for a moral understanding of the human being, what true ends in life are. I do find a difference there. I find the coercive power of the state to be reasonably effective with the bright lines of rights. And the rights that I'm thinking about, you can draw fairly clear, bright lines for. With the duties, they're much more nuanced, much more situation specific. So I consider those less amenable to the application of the coercive power of the state. Doesn't mean they're not important, but it means that we have to articulate, express, and ask people to live those out. What's a particular caution we should think about in this sort of a situation? Well, if history tells us anything, a robust doctrine of rights enforced by the rule of law, underlaid by a vital civil society, produces economic growth. That's the beginnings of economic growth in the late 18th century and in the Netherlands and in England and in other parts of the world. That's a good gift from God. Can we pervert it? We certainly can. If we take the ability of a well-formulated rights doctrine underlaid by an understanding of our duties to one another, and if that produces material well-being, one of the problems is that becomes the end rather than the means. We can have disordered desires. We can pervert that very good gift of God of creating wealth. So as I think about this, the caution is we have to understand where this takes us, and we have to see it as a means to achieve an important part of human flourishing, but not the end of human flourishing. The material well-being is something that I think it's appropriate to strive for, but we must always keep it in the perspective of what God truly calls us to.
Thank you, PJ. Larry?
Hi, my name is Larry Ward. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. I pastor a church called Abundant Life Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm sure you all have heard of the place because everybody now is wearing Red Sox. But anyway, I along with pastoring, I also a guest lecturer for Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, Boston campus, where started teaching there a while ago as a guest lecturer, working with churches who are starting economic development programs such as entrepreneurship in the church, and also working with young people, being a trainer for NIFTY, which is the National Foundation for Teaching Entrepreneurship, and working with young people and introducing them to how to start businesses. And so delighted today to be asked to share my concept of creativity. Thinking about creativity as I just excited about the fact that as you open up the scriptures, you see that God is a creator who comes on the scene and sees this really form and voidless earthly state that he comes across, and it begins to start organizing and start to revitalizing the planet. And it takes innovation, it takes creativity. My thought is that when it comes to creativity, could it be that God might want us to think about how we could create spaces and create places where we could imagine, where we could innovate, where we could actually be creative? I'm sure that as growing up, and I grew up as a boomer, and I'm a kind of late boomer, it was always something that you had to do to kind of create and innovate. We had a TV that sometimes lost its buttons. And so any of you that might know that, when you lost the buttons off the color TV, you kind of got this little thing called a pliers. And you started to turn it, and you turn the pliers till you got the channel that you wanted, or the rabbit ears fell off, and so you didn't go and throw the TV out. You got a piece of coat hanger and some. I think you were at my house, weren't you? You got a piece of coat hanger and some foil, and you kind of made do with whatever you had. But nowadays we need to think about innovation in a way that creates space where we can actually cause things to flourish as a people, as God's people. The way we do our work, and when we come across opportunities where things are not working, where things are not producing or causing things to flourish, that could it be that God is asking us and calling upon us to recreate and to innovate and have some imagination and put our strengths in a place where we could see development. As I look at young people, and as millennials and even as they call the Gen Zs are growing up, they really want to have this innovation happen. As a pastor in my local church, I ask myself all the time: is my church too boring for people that have this innovative, creative side of them? Can I set my service by the book where it's kind of putting people to sleep? And perhaps I need to bring those individuals to the forefront, and not so much just those who have artist capabilities, whether they're musicians or painters, but also business people who are entrepreneurial bent and can see even our systems that are not working correctly, and how we're not serving people and being hospitable and caring about people by having outdated systems and outdated ways of working with people and serving people. One of the things that I thought about this way also is how do we encourage people to come forward, such as our business owners and our entrepreneurs. Many of our entrepreneurs that I've talked to, they found that the church doesn't seem to connect very well in some cases where they are having the struggles in their businesses. They're only called upon when it comes to fundraising efforts, or can you give a check to the new project that we're doing, or can you serve in such a way to help us out, get us out of a business problem? But I think entrepreneurship is also giving that entrepreneur, first of all, that they are ministers of grace, that they are important. They do a job every day, and they must be encouraged to do that job as ministers of grace. Just as I stand in the pulpit and preach on Sunday, I think that just because I preach on Sundays and I think of myself as a minister of grace, I certainly want to think of them as ministers of grace. And certainly they need to be recognized that they're doing excellent work, They're bringing jobs to the community. They're actually bringing services to benefit the community. And certainly the church needs to have a space by which they are appreciated and also affirmed. One of the things that creativity is certainly, and innovation is a good thing, but sometimes it possibly could go off the track a little bit. Going off the track meaning that we start worshiping the things that we create, that we somehow get lost in the fact that God is our creator, he's our source, and that we somehow get caught up into what I've created is what I worship, and what I created identifies me who I am. I appreciate what Brother Isaac was saying about the technology, but I tell folks that technology is really about a tool. It's a tool. It's not your God. So when you lose your cell phone, don't stop coming to church and worshiping God because you couldn't find your cell phone. Get in your car and come to church and worship God, and don't miss the service because you lost your cell phone. Because after all is said and done, we want to worship God. We don't worship things. So I think that's somehow we have to really examine how we are working with our innovations and working with our technology, working with our hands and things that we create. Thing that we think about in terms of a kind of question is, how can we create better spaces, more innovation in our spaces of worship, also being innovative in our seminaries? My wife is a assistant dean of seminary of the Boston campus at Gordon Conwell. And a lot has come up when it comes to how to figure out how to serve students. And some of the curriculums that they're talking about trying to adjust is like, are we really preparing students for the real activity of being a Christ follower in the world? Is it just simply informing them about the theological, having a theological understanding of the scriptures, or is it preparing them to be innovative as they go into these spaces in their businesses as well as the church? And so that's a question that comes to mind when it comes to creativity.
Larry, thank you. Brent?
My name is Brent Waters. I'm a member of the faculty at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary, also director of the Stead Center for Ethics and Values. Before that, I directed a Center for Business, Religion, and Public Life at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Before that, I was an elderly doctoral student. Before that, I returned my alma mater to be chaplain at the University of Redlands, and before that was Iowa State University, and I'm not going any further back than that. Yeah. Lately, I've been pondering the two great commands: love God, love your neighbor. And I want to think about, is economic exchange a way of loving our neighbor? And if so, how would you conceive that? Because loving our neighbors is not an option, but a requirement of being a follower of Jesus Christ. As I read scripture, Jesus didn't say, try neighbor love. It's a good idea. He just said, love your neighbor.
Yeah.
But that gets very tricky. And as a moral theologian, I know that the love of God and the love of neighbor are not two loves, but they are one love. But I tend to concentrate on how do I love my neighbor. Okay, and following Karl Barth here, we encounter a wide range of neighbors. Some neighbors are our friends, some neighbors are our enemies. Some neighbors are near, some neighbors are far. And probably the most ubiquitous form of neighbors we encounter are strangers. But that's a marvelous encounter, because it is in encountering strangers that we do most of our exchanging. And exchanging is necessary for our well-being. Mm-hmm. And yet, it's a remarkable thing when we think about how much we trust strangers on a daily basis. In fact, I think we're the only species that trust strangers. Okay. And we need to, that is an art that needs to be cultivated. Now, I think exchange is an act of love because it promotes the material and physical well-being of our neighbors. And that's an important theological and moral task, because we have this thing called the incarnation, which is an extraordinary claim. The Word became flesh and was pleased to dwell among us. God becomes a creature. And that means we cannot despise our bodies. We cannot despise our physical reality, and we have to tend to them. And economic exchange is very important in tending to that reality. Now, increasingly, the strangers we encounter in our economic exchanges are invisible. They really are in the kind of globalized economy. I'll give you a quick example. Some of you have heard this example before. Just bear with me. I've reached the limits of my creativity. Let us imagine that I need a new laptop computer so I can continue to write books and articles read by very few people. So one night, late at night in a motel room, I go online and I order the computer of my dreams. Within 15 minutes, I'm a content and happy man. But what I'm unaware of is how many people I've just encountered. Because although the computer company is headquartered in California, the server it uses in Vancouver, Canada, the sales representative who reviews the order is in Dublin, the hardware and software has been manufactured in such places as Bucharest, Taiwan, Seoul. The computer is assembled in Shanghai and shipped to my doorstep by a company headquartered in Memphis, Tennessee. It doesn't work. I call the call center in Bangalore and finally get it running. All right. Now, I will probably never meet any of these neighbors, but I have interacted with hundreds across all sorts of jurisdictional areas. And the other thing I have to remember then is two things. I think I've enabled them in their material well-being, and they have certainly enabled me. And that's important. That is not to be despised. One of the things I tell my students, I know they don't believe me, but I tell them that I married into a business family. My father-in-law was in retail. I think he did more good for more people in a week than I will do in a lifetime. And I mean that sincerely. I mean, he did things I will never do, like pay people for a job, sell them products they need, provide service. I mean, I'm not service-oriented, I'm a tyrant. Anyway, but without this kind of exchange, our lives would be miserable, literally. I mean, think about it. This is another exercise I do in my class, and some of you heard it before. Like I said, bear with me, I'm old. I asked my students, how many of you woke up this morning in the building you built? No hands have ever gone up. I said, how many of you have grown your own food or slaughtered your own animals for breakfast this morning? A couple of times hands will go up and say, well, I'll grow my own garden. I said, where'd you get the seeds? I bought them. Okay, how many of you built the vehicle that you drove to campus today? And on and on. And if nothing else, economic exchange destroys the fiction of autonomy. Okay. We need one another.
Good language.
We need one another. In fact, we flourish when we get other people to do things for us because we do things for other people in return. Okay, so what kind of economic system do we need? Real quick, and PJ will correct everything I say from here on out. We should promote exchange. And by that, I think we need regulations, but we need smart regulations. Regulations that encourage the exchange and doesn't diminish them. We need entrepreneurial efforts. I mean, thank God for entrepreneurs. If it hadn't been for entrepreneurs, we'd still only have 3 phones from Ma Bill. We should promote job and wealth creation. And by that, I think one of the things I find strange teaching in seminary is how reluctant my students are to talk about money. And we shouldn't. It's an important topic. We should talk about what is the proper and good ways to earn money and to spend it wisely. And how should a system should promote the freedom to associate. Okay, there shouldn't be restrictions on the people that we choose to associate with, because that's terribly important. Now, the final one is, and I've written this before, and I've lost some friends, but I'm going to say it anyway. We should allow markets to work their creative destruction. Schumpeter coined the term. By the way, quick digestion on Schumpeter, because he didn't suffer from a weak ego, is late in his career, he was interviewed, and he said, I had 3 goals when I was a young economist, and that was to be the world's greatest economist, to be the world's greatest horseman, and to be the world's greatest lover. He paused and he said, "I still need to work at my horse riding."
That's awesome.
But anyway, what I want to say is that when the markets are working well, they are going to be destructive. And that's just a reality. And the goal is, how do we adapt to it? How do we enable people to respond to those kinds of changes? How do we give skills and the education that people need to participate in markets and to participate well? I think that's really the challenge, because I'm not going to argue that creative destruction is the work of the Holy Spirit, but creative destruction provides opportunities for the Holy Spirit to be at work that did not exist previously, and we should take advantage of those opportunities. Finally, almost done. Cautionary note. Exchange is a means and never an end. We don't exchange for the purpose of exchanging. Rather, our end is not to be reduced to being either producers or consumers, even though production and consumption is important. Our proper end is to love God and to love neighbor. And on this side of eternity, our end in respect to neighbors is koinonia. Koinonia is a very interesting word. You can translate it as community, or communion, and communicate. And communicate is not simply telling information. To communicate the goods of creation is where we flourish. Because in an exchange, which is important, it always means what is yours becomes mine, and what is mine becomes yours. But that's not where we flourish. This is why we do not buy the body and blood when we go to the Eucharist. Okay? Or do we tip the priest? But rather, to communicate the goods of creation means what is yours and what is mine becomes ours. And we need those communicative associations like church, family, and volunteer organizations to flourish, because I think that's where human beings flourish. The exchange enables it, but it's not the end. And that's all.
Beautiful. So thank you, Brent. And one of the things that I love as I've prayed for the Spirit to guide our conversation are the threads in the tapestry that you guys have brought together in a beautiful picture. I mean, when I think, Isaac, you opening in the sense of the image of God, the very center of that Genesis text, Kevin highlighting exile, stranger, commonplace, PJ focusing, on human dignity and rights that flow out of the Imago Dei, Larry, you highlighting the sense of creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship, and you bringing it to that core text, which obviously I have a deep affection for as well, and neighborly love, that to center this economic reality in loving God and loving our neighbor. And I love particularly your integral nature of that vertical horizontal love, if I maybe use a dichotomy at that point, but I love the synergy of that. So a couple questions I have, and I know, again, I'm going to encourage everyone to jump in on Slido, and if you'll bring it up for the questions, that would be great. But thank you. I've just sensed a beautiful tapestry and the threads you've woven in very important areas as we think about how theology profoundly shapes economic life and how the gospel informs and transforms this conversation. So just a couple questions I have to get started, and we have some really good questions. I think this ties together profoundly is talk a little bit about one of the conversations I have most is let's just say in a free market exchange, which is, in my view, the best of a worse system. Okay, it's not perfect. There are all kinds of challenges with it. We have a real dynamic of wealth inequality. How would your understanding of theology and economic life in your location as a professor, pastor, economist, how do you navigate that reality of this wealth inequality? What would you say to that, to a person who raises that question, which is a real issue in the free market context we now live in? So I just love each one. First of all, I think that's a really common and a really important conversation. So would you jump in a little bit on wealth inequality, and we'll go to some of the questions, but that's, I'd like to just hear your thoughts on that. Just short thoughts.
I'll start.
Okay.
Dangerous ground. Inequality is certainly a crucial issue. The real inequality is inequality of access. So the inequality of access to opportunity, all of those sorts of things. I don't mean to dismiss the problem of inequality of results. And sometimes that's a very important measure of what the inequality of access looks like. But one of the issues that I have with continually looking at the material measures of inequality of results is it can force us into what I would call a zero-sum view of the world. And we look at people who have wealth, and the argument is if only they didn't have it, the rest of us would have it. That is not necessarily the case. In a positive sum, wealth-producing society, there will be inequalities. And so that's one of the dangers I have of looking at that. I want to look at where people are hurting, where they're marginalized, where they're oppressed. And so I want to focus on those sorts of things, the people that are in some sense left out, that aren't able to do well in the exchange economy. Inequality can be a rough measure of that, but sometimes we spend so much time thinking about that issue that the real issue is who's hurting, who's in poverty, what's happening there. So I'm somewhat uncomfortable with just going directly to the inequality sort of an issue. The other sort of thing to remember is that material inequality is only one of a number of inequalities. We have to think about all of those. But certainly the concept of the equality before God keeps coming back to give me a sense of where has inequality resulted in injustice. Inequality is not necessarily injustice, but it's a way of thinking about where injustices might have occurred.
Okay, can I just tell you on that, one of the distinctions we often make, and I think there's validity to it, but I love thoughts on this, is we make a distinction between equal opportunity and equal outcomes in economic exchange. What are your thoughts about that? That is a common frame. Do you think that's wise? Is that problematic? Or does that help us illuminate the path ahead in terms of navigating economic justice and opportunity? Your thoughts on that? That's a very common frame. Is that legitimate? Is that helpful?
I think that's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I have the total answer to that. I think when I think about economics and equality and equity, Tim Keller said something that was very interesting about how do we theologically think about these things and how do we might approach it. And he said three things. Basically, there is need for relief, that there are times when you're dealing with poverty and it does need to have resources to bring relief. And that's an important aspect of the gospel. We do bring relief. Second part of that is that there's a development side of that as well. That it's important that if you have communities or persons that are suffering from poverty, how do we help them and help that community develop its assets and bring those assets into a place where they can flourish. And then thirdly, there are certain systems that are there that keep poverty perpetuated. I came from a community where banks would redline. And if you know anything about the Roxbury community in Boston, you heard about certain communities. I lived in a community where there were no banks lending money to any people who lived in that community. Yeah. So the question is, well, you can bring relief, you can pour money into it, you can teach us how to try to develop our resources, but it was a system that had to be broken down, a system that had to be changed that continued to perpetuate that poverty. It's a lot going with that. So I'm not sure if I answered the question.
It's a good framework.
It's just kind of my thought.
Okay. Let me also go, you want to jump in on that one? Just real quick, Kevin?
Real quick, I think often in the conversation about equal access, equal opportunity, we presume an equal starting place, which I think is a false notion. The requirement on us as people of faith, as the body of Christ, means that no matter where we started or where we happen to be, it, again, is stepping into that common space and leveraging our collective resources to do the right thing and to do it the right way.
It's wonderful. Okay, good word. Okay, so I'm going to go to a question here. I'm going to direct it first to you, Brent, because you were unpacking the incredible opportunity for neighborly love globally in exchange. I mean, I think that's one thing we often miss from India. But here we have a question here of our own virtuous responsibility. We have, how do we respond when a company involved in our economic activity, buying a computer, probably hanging with you, practices injustice? What's our culpability, responsibility, or accountability, or is there? It's a very good question, I think. And somebody else can help answer, but start. Would you start, Brent, on that?
Yeah.
Our role as Christians and as followers of Jesus.
I'm just stalling.
Because you've highlighted beautifully the upside of this in a powerful way of opportunity and goodness. But
Well, I
not the
think it's
downside.
one thing to keep in mind because, look, I've spent most of my career in progressive academic settings, so that to commend business is to commend the devil.
Okay,
All right. And that's just what I've grown weary of.
sure.
So I think you start off by saying, okay, the fact that you have corrupt companies that they're still newsworthy, that's a good sign because it means it's not the ordinary. Okay, it's not the routine. It's not the routine. Okay, I got that. I thought you wanted to drink. But I guess at this time in the morning it'd be Bloody Marys, wouldn't it? But anyway, now completely off track. But anyway, I guess but I think yes, you do have a responsibility to call a corrupt corporation to account. And this is why I said you need regulations, but they need to be smart regulations, so regulatory. So to show the difference, yeah, I want the government inspecting the safety of like food packing.
Right.
I don't want the government telling me what my diet should be.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, and I think that's the thing to keep in mind is what are the limits of good regulations? What do they seek to achieve? So again, I mean, it was probably a good innovation when Arthur Andersen went out of business, because you shouldn't be auditing the people that you're giving advice to on their investments. I mean, didn't anyone say this might be a conflict?
Time out.
Yeah, so it's that. But I think part of the problem we have right now is that there is no consensus as to what constitutes moral business. And that means that's one of the things I think we need to keep working at, is to be in conversation with businesses, is saying who are all your stakeholders and what responsibilities do you have to them.
It's really good. Anyone else want to keep on that one? Okay, let's go right to that, because I think you're leaning into that. We have one that says, should the goal of business be maximization of profit? Is this the purpose of economic exchange? Why or why not? What's the goal of economics? And again, there's just been a lot of conversation on multiple bottom lines. People, planet, profit, economics, and mutuality. What are your thoughts about the goal of business? That's, I think, a real important thing we're talking about here for economic exchange. You else want to jump in there? What are the goal or goals?
Okay,
Tell us.
I'll jump in. Profits are just a necessary measure of how well you are serving other people. And so if you try to ignore that, you're ignoring this. How do you do well in that sort of system? You cooperate better. You cooperate better as a workplace. You cooperate better in terms of doing your whom you serve with your product. So to try to think about ignoring profit, it just means we're going to ignore a measure of the degree of service. Should that be the only measure? No, it should not. It's hard to institute other, I mean, the triple bottom line is an appropriate sort of an idea. Trying to specify all the ways beyond that you ought to think about profits or the other profits becomes more difficult. And I think a lot of it does depend upon people articulating those other sorts of triple bottom lines. I get nervous when we try to write them down, make them a part of the law. I think you end up with lots of more room for shirking in that sort of a situation than you do to start with.
I would just add, too, I mean, particularly for those of us in the academy, there's a certain hypocrisy when we condemn profits. And what I mean by that is I'm in an endowed chair, okay? And I know exactly where that money comes from. And I have a colleague who also has an endowed chair. And she asked me on a number of occasions, isn't it immoral to make a profit? And I kept saying, no. Well, the last time she asked me, I said, if you really believe that, you need to resign. I haven't been asked a question since. But I think what it is just saying, look, endowments are good things for institutions precisely because they investments in corporations that render a profit. Now, again, institutions have got to set guidelines on what they will invest in and what they will not. And if you believe, for example, that arms manufacture is immoral, you probably shouldn't invest in those companies. But I think we do not do ourselves credit if we don't realize, okay, corporations by their nature are going to generate profit or they won't be around.
Right. Okay, Larry?
I think that, when it comes to profits, as you're talking about measurements, it's not simply just money either. Mm-hmm. And I don't think because you're a nonprofit that nonprofit organization, that you shouldn't be concerned about profits. Because if you are a nonprofit and you don't concern yourself with profits, you won't be profitable and you'll be out of business.
That's right.
So being that's the case, I think that when it comes to profits and thinking about, of course, the first thing is money, what's the bottom line. But I think as believers, we have to kind of think about, well, what are the measurements of profits in terms of how are our workers doing? How are they flourishing? Right. How is the total operation and those measurements? And I think that when it comes to profitability, I think that has to be taken into consideration even with making profits financially.
Excellent thought. And I know for time, great questions, everybody. There's so many. I want to go, just because I have the frame, how does virtue and purpose fit into economic theory? Isaac, you are a pastor, you're church planning, I share your journey. You have a PhD in economics. At least start the conversation. How does a virtuous actor, not only does that work, but as a pastor, local church, what's our stewardship in nourishing spiritual formation and virtuous actors in an economic context?
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off of what you mentioned there, PJ. I like the triple bottom line. You added the Trinitarian dimension to that. Yeah. But yeah, I think when it comes to our motivations because economics is the study of motivations, right? Why do we do the things that we do? What drives us? What determines our behaviors? And I think in large part when we think about, why do we engage in creative activities or there's obviously the profit-seeking motive. I think the issue is often we improperly define profit because sometimes we don't take into account the implicit benefits and the implicit costs of engaging in that sort of activity. I start a bakery not simply because it's profitable, but because I like the smell of bread. I start a bakery because I like to see that people are fed. And I'm in the business and the ministry of feeding people. And so I think what happens is that when we get into, when we start thinking of economics in sort of this cold way that doesn't take into account the deep inner desires that we have inside, the questions of why do we exist and what is right, take into consideration a sort of higher power, I'm talking to the millennials here, what is right and what is wrong. I think if we can reframe the conversation, say that what motivates us is more than just the dollars and cents, but that there are other dimensions to what we do and how we do it. And so again, if you ask me within the context of my church plant, so most of my members are all entrepreneurs. So very few people are actually employed in a corporation. The average age in my church is 27 years old. So that kind of gives you a sense of how young our church is. I'm one of the old guys at my church. I'm the old man, literal elder at the church. And the oldest guy at our church is actually a real estate investor who's 47 years old. And most of them are creative. They're thinking a lot about how to change the world, but it tends to be moralistic, and it tends to be deterministic, and it tends to be me-centered and what I get out of it, and I want to change the world. And so reframing that, I think the challenge is, at least in my congregation, is to reframe and say that, well, yes, work is good, but work isn't good for your own self-expression or for your own glory or what you get out of it, but that in all things we do it for the glory of God. And so we exist to glorify God. That's a tough message for the millennial, because when they begin to think that way and begin to reframe their perspective, not inwardly, but outwardly, then we can address the questions of morality and the questions of virtue and the questions of purpose. Why am I here? Why do I sell bread? I don't simply sell bread because it gives me joy to see people eat bread. I sell bread because inherently I'm glorifying God in it. And so if you ask me on a practical level, on the ground level, this is what I try to beat them in the head with my Bible.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And just
Or my iPad.
Yeah, thank you all. Our time is up. There's some more questions. And the anonymous person who asked Brent about his great book, I would encourage you to grab him, because that's a really good question we didn't get to on self-interest and how that fits into the Christian narrative. So,
By the way, I reserved the movie rights and any action figures.
so let's give this panel, it's been a delight to serve with you. Give them a great hand, okay? Thank you, guys. Great work.